security at. The first level is the set of threats that are common to everyone, that are just very basic to your network itself, and that applies to enterprises as well as consumers. In fact, consumers are a good example of this. There are very basic steps that you should do in order to be able to secure your passwords around the net. There are basic things that you should do to be able to secure your routers. The same types of principles apply to enterprises. There are very basic pieces of your infrastructure that you need to have to be able to prevent the simple attacks that are coming across the entire web. But in addition to that, you have to consider the unique incentives that your enterprise presents to attackers. So I was the product manager for click fraud protection at Google. Google, at that point, made more than 99% of its revenues from pay-per-click advertising. And as a result of that, creating click fraud was one of the primary incentives to be able to create click bots as well as other automated systems to be able to attack Google's network. Because of that incentive, Google had a requirement to invest a significant amount of money and resources in detecting and preventing click fraud. So every single business that's out there presents different opportunities to attackers. So financial institutions obviously provide a different type of opportunity than an e-commerce website. So you have to try and anticipate, in addition to the common parts of your infrastructure that protect against the attacks that affect everyone, what is it about your individual business that needs to be protected differently from every other company? And in most cases, you're talking about something which is going to be unique to your website, unique to your user interface, unique to your business model itself. And there are different points at which an attacker can press in order to be able to bring your site down or bring your business down. And I think that that's where you really need creativity. And at the same time, I think that there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of reason to be optimistic about being able to protect those areas, because there is greater awareness of how to be able to share those best practices and how to be able to create both custom as well as one-size-fits-all solutions.
Elon, any thoughts on that, on preventative steps, actions to take?
You know, what's interesting to me is how much we are behind, how much we need to do to go back to basic in so many ways. Our ecosystem is so diverse in today's environment, and things like patching. You know, we all do patching. It's such a trivial thing to do, and yet so few companies get patching right. Or secure coding practices. SQL injections been known to exist for over 10, 15 years. Yet you got some prime players, vendors that are key to the financial industry where they have SQL injection all over the place. So you look into things like that, and an example, not that $45 million, but something very similar, $8 million. A company that is servicing a lot of the financial industry had a breach because of a misconfigured web server in their environment. The hackers were able to get in, probably the same group, navigated through all their environment to get their prepaid platform. $8 million later, they were discovered. So things as basic as that, we are still not doing very well. Secure coding practices is something that should be the bread and butter of every company that puts itself on the web. I would say 90% are getting it wrong.
Caleb, any additional?
Yeah, so my last company was focused on web security vulnerabilities. In fact, we produced the first white paper on SQL injection. So I have a lot in terms of the basics and fundamentals of what you need to do in security coding. And I agree with Elon here 100%. When you look at just the history of security, the actual problems, the vulnerabilities, the actual issues themselves have never changed. They've always been the same. Authentication, input validation, misconfiguration, secure coding. All of these things have never changed since the beginning. The only thing that's changed is it's been implemented in new technologies. And I think, one of the things I've always envisioned was sort of the ability of security should never be bolted on top. It should always be built in, right? In fact, my last company's message was that, is you should never have to buy a security service or a security product. It should always be built into what you're doing. The problem, it's a great message, but the biggest problem is that with the way that technology evolves and how fast things move, your job is never security as your top priority. When you're a developer, you're building out a product, your number one job is to get the product out, get it working, and making it so that it beats your competitors. right? Getting the revenue, getting the money, and getting the business done. And unfortunately, security has always been the last thing to do. Now, I would say security's gone up a little bit. You're in the top 5, right, in terms of doing things. But when you look at secure coding practices, for example, one of the biggest issues we found in secure coding practices is every developer would tell you they'd love to do secure coding. They'd love to do it. But ultimately, when you go down and you start telling people, hey, guess what? Like, take these code scanners, for example. What they do is they'll tell you all the mistakes that you make when you're writing your code. You know what that produces for the developer? A big to-do list. And you know what that means? Oh, let me add that on to my other big to-do list that is higher priority for my bosses in order to get this stuff fixed. And so building it in at the beginning and baking it in is absolutely awesome in terms of theory, but when it comes to reality, it will never change. We're always producing new technologies, we're always going to be evolving, and we're always going to be putting out stuff to get things out as fast as possible to be competitors, and security will always be in the top 5 or lower on that priority list, right? That will never change. And the thing is, attacks and hackers will always be evolving, and we're never going to be able to keep up. It is the arms race, right? There's no such thing as 100% security, and there never will be. It'll always be a problem, and we will always deal with it. And I can guarantee you this, I bet 10 years from now, we're still going to be dealing with SQL injection.
Hopefully not.
Caleb, good term, it's an arms race. What role does government have, and I'll open this up to the panel, in trying to resolve some of these issues or any of these issues? Is there a regulatory role either here domestically or as well internationally? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I want to say, I'm reluctant to involve the government in things like that. However, threat intelligence sharing has been proven very useful, especially in denial of service attacks among us banks. And we do have forms to do that, and actually they became very active with the denial of service and had been very successful at allowing us as an industry to face those down. I would expect the government to make that kind of threat sharing, intelligence sharing more productive, as well as to have some kind of task force. I mean, we try to go to, say, the local FBI and tell them, somebody was trying to steal money from our online account, and they don't know what to do with it. So,
there's the threat. When we were first starting CloudFlare, I used to participate on panels like this, and I would get up and I would say, we need to share more data between organizations and make it more available. And 4 years later, I'm a little, hopefully, wiser, and I think that we do need to share data. The thing is that the big organizations do share data like crazy. The banks share data between other banks because banks understand other banks and understand how to use that data. A lot of other large companies like web companies, Google, Yahoo, Amazon, share data. There are lists where people can share that, and you're not invited to those lists until you're one of those companies. The challenge that we have is we have tons of data. We see 4% of all web requests. And at the end of the day, security is a data game. Our challenge is that as we share data, it's very hard for us to share it in a way that it can be consumed and understood. So, for example, it's not true that an IP address is either good or bad. It's good or bad within a context generally. If I see an IP address coming from Kazakhstan and it's going to a Portland-based weather website, that has a different security threshold than if that same IP address is going to a Kazakh weather-related website. And so how that data gets shared is very hard, and what we're always concerned about is that as we share data, people will make binary decisions on what is not actually binary data. And that's actually an extremely hard problem. In terms of the role of the government, CISPA and a lot of the other data sharing arrangements that have been proposed, I think that what I'm concerned about is twofold. One, I think that the role, there's something very incumbent in a company like CloudFlare that sits in front of so many web requests, that we don't become a tool of law enforcement to make law enforcement's job easier, and at the same time we don't become a tool of law enforcement to make law enforcement's job harder, right? We should be transparent to the fullest extent. And so the data sharing, I think has to come inherently with some protections of privacy of individuals as they're transversing some of these networks. And I think that's actually something that's really important and a discussion that hasn't been fully fleshed out. The second thing, which is a little more fuzzy, is that because there is a lot of data sharing today, as a recovering lawyer, what I'm concerned about is that the lawyers in the room, when they hear that, you know, CISPA has been passed and here's the way we share data, are going to shut down all the super secret lists that exist right now, where data is actually being shared and work is getting done. The challenge with putting in place a sort of prescribed taxonomy of how you have to share data in order to qualify for a safe harbor means that a lot of the more ad hoc, more useful data sharing between organizations that are trying to do things like stop alerts, denial of service attacks becomes much more challenging. And so when I hear about the data sharing problem, the question that I keep coming back to and that I ask legislators when they ask me is, what problem are you trying to solve? And I've yet to have someone give a really clear answer to that. The best that I've had is, gosh, we're sharing a lot of data as it is, and we're slightly afraid that there might be some liability if we share something that's wrong. Maybe you could give us a little bit of a safe harbor for that. And that's about the best answer that I've gotten. But it's I'm actually these data exchange markets within large organizations function much more robustly than I thought they did 4 years ago when I wasn't invited to them. Now that I am invited to them, there actually is quite a bit of data exchange that goes on right now.
Other thoughts on that?
So I think that it's a question that remains to be seen whether or not the government can really make a big difference when it comes to this area. You look at physical security, and we don't expect small businesses or even large businesses to be able to protect their own airspace or their own land and sea areas. When you're talking about an attack, a piece of malware that may have had the equivalent of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars invested in creating it, you're talking about something like a nation-state level form of attack, or even an organized criminal organization creating a very sophisticated attack. That's really beyond the capability of any small business and most large businesses to be able to defend themselves against. So how can we respond? How can we say, as a society, here is a way to be able to provide common protection across all businesses? I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, but clearly there is a need to be able to meet very large-scale threats with large-scale solutions of some kind. The point that the industry is at right now is really a very primitive one when you think about the notion of talking about IP addresses and saying we're going to either block or allow an IP address based on bad behavior or good behavior. Because we know that there are hundreds of millions of machines that have been compromised around the world. Potentially more than 300 million machines have malware on them right now. The industry tried for over 2 decades to prevent malware from getting on machines. We failed, and now the malware is out there. It's capable of taking legitimate IP addresses that are used most of the day for legitimate activities and then turning them into malicious actors when the malware comes to life. So at that point, what do? You can't have false positives when you're talking about creating an experience which is going to be scalable for all of your legitimate users, and you don't want to have false negatives because you don't want to miss the bad stuff. So I think that we need to get much more sophisticated in our defenses, just as the attacks have become more sophisticated as well.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, when you think about the government, obviously they're very early in terms of trying to figure out how to do things here. But there is one thing that I think the government has done really well that has helped a lot in the security industry. And it's not that the government shouldn't really tell you how to secure what you have, but the ability of them putting in things like disclosure laws, I think, have been extremely helpful. When you're a company and you know that under a law that if you get attacked or personal information has been breached and you are under law in order to disclose that, that's egg on your face. Now, how much of that happens and how much of it is real, how much do they need to spend, who knows? But the thing is it something that is, I think as a good law that says, you know what, as a consumer, as an individual, I would like to know if my information was breached at any point, and that also forces the company that's in charge of that to figure out measures to make that less likely to happen. Wow, remember how we talked about a little bit earlier, security is always low on that priority list? That kind of law or those types of things coming in from the government does inch that up a little bit higher. And I think that's been very helpful.
See, and I totally disagree. I mean, at least I'll push back on that. Like, of course, as a consumer, I want my information disclosed if there's been a breach. But my hunch is that if you actually play the economics out, that the disclosure laws actually lead to less information sharing between different organizations, which as a result of that means that there's actually less security between those organizations, because people then tend to be ostriches that don't want to disclose anything because the lawyers in the room say, gosh, now we're going to qualify for the California disclosure law, which means that we should bury this and hide it, which is exactly the opposite of what we should do, right? We as a company, we screw up all the time. And anyone who tells you they're going to screw up is lying to you. And what's been really refreshing to me is I sit in meetings with very large banks, and they print out our blog posts where we say, here's the way we screwed up. And they said, we need more people to be like this. The challenge is that if I feel like, the fact that we are obligated as a government, the government obligates us to disclose in a certain way at a certain time and send the disclosures out, I think actually discourages the more minor disclosure, which is something that what we want. What you want is less penalty for disclosure from the government actors and more reward from consumers for companies that are responsible. And again, I think that's hard, but these are really tricky issues to get right.